So it's really lovely to see everyone this afternoon. I hope you all had a good and restful spring break. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jenny Yakuta. I'm a political theorist in the Department of Political Science in the Kinder Institute here at Mizzou. And today I have the great pleasure of introducing Professor Duong, who will be giving a talk titled Two Views of Universal Suffrage, Anti-Colonial and Neoliberal, which is part of his second book project, tentatively titled Dream Worlds of Democracy. Professor Duong is an assistant professor of politics at the University of Virginia with a focus on European political thought and intellectual history. In particular, he is interested in how the revolutionary agency of the people is expressed. The dissertation he wrote at Cornell won the Leo Strauss Award in 2017, which is the annual prize from the American Political Science Association for the best dissertation in political theory. This dissertation then formed the basis of his first book, called The Virtues of Violence, Democracy and Disintegration in Modern France, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. He is also the author of articles in journals such as the American Political Science Review, Modern Intellectual History, and Political Theory. Serendipitously, his newest piece, Universal Suffrage Decolonization, was just published in the most recent issue of the APSR. As is our norm, Professor Duong will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes, which will then be followed by about 30 to 40 minutes of Q&A. So if you'd like to ask a question during the Q&A, please indicate this in the chat box so that I know to call on you when the time comes. All right, the floor is yours, Kevin.
Great, thanks everyone for being here. I'm going to share my screen. I hope this works. Do people see slides? Great. I think I've timed this to be exactly 40 minutes. So let's go ahead and get started. Thanks to Jenny and thanks to the Kinder Institute for inviting me. In his 1920 book, Dark Water, W.E.B. Du Bois wrote the following about universal suffrage. We must remember that if the theory of democracy is correct, the right to vote is not merely a privilege, not simply a method of meeting the needs of a particular group, and least of all, a matter of recognized want or desire. The real argument for democracy is that in the people, we have the source of that endless life and unbounded wisdom which the rulers of men must have. A given people today may not be intelligent, but through a democratic government that recognizes not only the worth of the individual to himself, but the worth of his feelings and experiences to all, they can educate not only the individual unit, but generation after generation. And then Du Bois concluded that universal suffrage, quote, is alone the method of showing the whole experience of the race for the benefit of the future. A method of showing the whole experience of the race for the benefit of the future, a source of endless life and unbounded wisdom. It might not be obvious at first glance, but Du Bois's description here of universal suffrage flies in the face of our common sense views. We usually think of universal suffrage as a collective decision-making procedure, a way to collect preferences. And it's usually conceived as an aggregation of equal voices. Votes are counted, not weighed, and the majority carries the day. This commonplace view of universal suffrage isn't actually what Du Bois had in mind. For Du Bois, the right to vote isn't first and foremost a collective decision-making procedure. It's a way of gathering together, amplifying, and gifting the wisdom of a whole people to the future. It conveys that wisdom contained in the feelings and experiences of the people to humanity as a whole. It's also job training for democracy. Political power is like a musical instrument. Its mastery is a matter of practice. So voting year after year, generation after generation, conveys the demos to self-ruling maturity. The people learn to wield their power the more they're called to do so. And at his most utopian, Du Bois believed that eventually the people would learn to use their ballots to subject the economy to democratic control. Doing so would create, quote, a new unity of human beings and an obliteration of human hatred festering along the color line. Universal suffrage, when applied to the economy, would create, quote, modern democracy in industry. And with that, Du Bois joined communist politics. Du Bois wrote these lines about universal suffrage in 1920, and they were prophetic. They placed him at the head of a generation of writers who within 15 years would attribute to the universal franchise a singular power to recreate democracy and the economy. Consider the decades from 1930 to 1960. These are usually remembered as the high point of decolonization. Indonesia wins its independence in 1945. The partition of India and Pakistan occurs in 1947. In 1954, French forces in Vietnam are defeated, which initiates France's permanent withdrawal from Indochina. Ghana declares independence from British rule in 1957. Algeria wins independence in 1960. These are heady years. Yet we often forget that this age of decolonization was, as Du Bois predicted, also an age of universal suffrage. The period of decolonization is some of the largest electorate expansions in modern history. Between 1944 and 1962, 12 Anglo-Caribbean colonies achieved universal suffrage. In 1956, most French colonial citizens, including Muslim women, win the right to vote. In virtually every nation that is newly liberated from colonial rule, universal suffrage for both sexes is immediately implemented. What this means is that actually in most cases, former colonies achieved universal suffrage before the so-called developed metropoles did. India immediately enshrined universal suffrage for both sexes in its 1950 constitution. African Americans have to wait until the 1965 Voting Rights Act to win de facto voting rights. The purpose of my talk today is to stage a confrontation between two utopian views of universal suffrage. And these two views emerged in the historical crucible I've just outlined. The first view is what I'll call an anti-colonial vision of universal suffrage. This extended and developed a hope we already find in Du Bois, namely that universal suffrage could point towards a democratic economy and abolish the color line. In its first view, universal suffrage, the end of colonialism, and economic democracy were bound together like links on a chain. The second view of universal suffrage emerged at the same time as the first. Already by the end of the interwar period, early neoliberal thinkers like Ludwig von Mises were insisting that in their view, true universal suffrage actually had nothing to do with ballots. It had everything to do with consumer purchasing power. The second view imagined true universal suffrage in the market exchange. There, in the market, each consumer could express their voice by spending dollars. There, in the market, each consumer could express their voice and the amplitude of their voice by the number of dollars they had. And every dollar spent affected the overall equilibrium of the market. So sure, even though each person's voice had a different magnitude based on the number of dollars they had, at least every dollar spent contributed to the dynamic processes of mutual adjustment, which made the market a system of spontaneous social coordination. Put simply, in the market, even if everyone's voice isn't equal, at least everyone's dollar counts. For neoliberal economists, the spontaneous order of the market was actually more inclusive than electoral politics governed by majority rule. As they like to say so often, every penny was a ballot. This second view of universal suffrage, I'm going to suggest, can be seen as a response to the first. The prospect of universal enfranchisement in newly independent territories raised the specter of majority non-white electorates. These majority non-white electorates, it was feared, would use their mass suffrage, the sheer power of numbers, to implement economic democracy in the third world, what some came to call African socialism. It was in fear of that socialism, as well as a permanent white minority status, that encouraged economists associated with the Mont-Pelerin Society to develop their alternative conception of the market as universal suffrage. The story I've just sketched is broad and extremely generalized. So what I want to do today is to tell a small piece of this story by focusing on a limited set of protagonists. For the vision of anti-colonial universal suffrage, I'll be revisiting the speeches and essays of Aimé Césaire and Léopold Sédar Senghor, both politicians and poets of the French Fourth Republic. But the neoliberal vision of universal suffrage will be focusing on members of the Mont Pelerin Society, especially men like Arthur Shenfield and William Hutt. And I hope that the fragments of the story I tell you today can give you a sense of the philosophical stakes at play, where there were, I think, profound philosophical stakes. What does it mean to have a voice in politics? And who is it that is speaking when we finally expand this suffrage? Are we hearing the voice of individuals, races, market forces? The history of universal suffrage doesn't only contain battles over the terms of civic inclusion. It also involves struggles about how to answer these very fundamental questions of democratic theory. In my remaining time with you all, I'll try to do three things. First, I'll discuss how anti-colonial intellectuals imagined universal suffrage as a way of challenging empire. Second, I'll discuss how intellectuals associated with the Mont Pelerin Society articulated their own alternative view, especially when faced with global debates about apartheid South Africa. Finally, in the conclusion, I'll use the debate I've staged to draw out larger conclusions about the connection between universal suffrage and popular sovereignty. So let me start with anti-colonial universal suffrage. In 1944, France was embarking on a constitutional refounding. For 4 years, France had been occupied by the Nazis and led by a collaborationist government, Vichy France. And liberation in 1944 gave France a chance to repudiate Nazism. It was obvious, even at the time, that it would have been ludicrously hypocritical for the French to disavow Nazism, but to continue holding onto their empires on racial grounds. Simone Weil remarked at the time that, quote, "Fighting against the Germans is not sufficient proof we love freedom, given France's true Hitlerian style in Africa and Indochina. Liberation from Nazism meant that it was time for colonial reform." In October 1944, French electors selected a constituent National Assembly to draft a new post-liberation French constitution. And among those elected were these two men, Sengor and Césaire. Sengor had been born in Senegal, but he won a scholarship to study in Paris at the Lycée Louis le Grand, where he met Césaire, who was in the year below him. Césaire was, for his part, from Martinique, and he too won a scholarship to study in Paris. The two were studying literature. They shared a love for the surrealists, modernists like Rimbaud, and the Harlem Renaissance poets like Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and writers like Richard Wright. They also imbibed as students cutting-edge work in anthropology, works by Leo Frobonius that argued for the distinctive civilizational value of Africanity. Sengor and Césaire were, in short, educated in a pair swept up in an interwar phenomenon that literary scholars have told us a lot about, which is the rise of a transatlantic African modernism, stretching from Harlem to Paris, wherein Black intellectuals of all stripes were exploring their Africanity by way of avant-garde art and poetry. It was in this aesthetic environment that Césaire coined the term negritude. And negritude would soon become one of the most important currents of Black aesthetic modernism in the 20th century. Right before the war broke out, Césaire had returned to Martinique to teach French literature. And that was actually where he taught Fanon and Edward Glissant. Sengor, for his part, was actually drafted into the war, and part of the war, he was interned at a labor camp. With liberation from Nazi occupation in 1944, they're both elected as representatives to the Constituent Assembly on behalf of Martinique and Senegal. So began an extraordinary experiment in which two poets from France's empire helped craft the new French Constitution. And their role wasn't just symbolic. The first draft of the Constitution was so covered with Sengor's fingerprints that critics always condescendingly called it the Sengor Constitution or the Sengor draft. The fate of this Constitution writing process is well known, and there's no need to rehash it here. Suffice it to say that the process was awful. In the end, there was no single electoral college nor universal suffrage. White Europeans and settlers had their own voter lists, which guaranteed them an enormously outsized voice in the legislature. Throughout this process, though doomed as it was, Césaire and Sengor fought for as egalitarian and universal of a franchise as possible. But here's the catch. They wanted universal suffrage for the overseas territories, for sure, but they didn't want it because they wanted civic inclusion, or at least not in any straightforward way. They wanted universal suffrage, but they absolutely did not want the suffrage to become a vector for cultural assimilation. As Sengor put it in 1945, quote, "We want the authentic voice of Africa to be heard." As modernist poets of negritude, they'd spent the interwar years raging against assimilation, and it would have been inconceivable for either of them to defend universal suffrage if it was going to simply be a conveyor belt to assimilation and cultural repression. Consider this extraordinary passage Sengor wrote in a 1945 essay for Esprit, the kind of left-wing Catholic newspaper. He wrote this on the eve of the Constitution writing process. How would the representatives of the colonial peoples be elected, and what would their powers be? I can only touch on generalities. I am not a fan of the ballot, which is a European mode of election. I do not want the vote to be individual. I would rather it be familial in Black Africa, which would be in the tradition of the country, provided that the woman could make her voice heard. I'm not a fan of the ballot, which is a European mode of election. I do not want the vote to be individual. What's Sengor saying here? The ballot has an expressive power, but the voice that needs to be expressed shouldn't be the voice of an abstract individual. It had to be the voice of a people, a civilization, a culture. Sengor always insisted that individualism was an obsession of European political theory. Universal suffrage for a post-colonial future had to avoid reducing universal suffrage to universal individual enfranchisement. Treating the ballot as a possession of individuals would mean reproducing a European understanding of society as an aggregation of individual proprietors. In other words, it would make Europeans ventriloquize Europeans. It would impose on Africans an individualist orientation towards politics. We don't often think of the ballot as a way of giving a voice to a culture or a race, but that's exactly what Sengor hoped for. And in his view, one way of organizing universal suffrage in conformity with African civilization would be to organize it around family ballots. As Sengor explained time and again in his writings, Africans believed, quote, the basic cell of society was the family. African Negro society is in effect made up of widening concentric circles, superimposed and interlaced. And so Sengor concluded the mode of election that could enunciate the voice of African society would be a balloting system that accommodated the expression of collective voices. After all, humanity wasn't made up of individuals. It was made up of families, clans, villages, races, and civilizations. Aimé Césaire made a similar set of arguments. He wanted universal suffrage, but he too was reluctant to organize electoral democracy around an abstract individualism. As a deputy involved with the Constitution writing process, Césaire fought for the integration of Martinique into the French Republic as an administrative department. So this is known as the 1946 departmentalization law, which transformed Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Réunion into overseas departments of France. So the idea is that they'd be separated by an ocean, otherwise administratively equivalent to department in the hexagon. So far, so good, except when it came to actually design the electoral districts. When the rubber hit the road, Césaire sensed a nefarious assimilationism at work in the drawing of the voting precincts and the newly departmentalized territories. Here is Césaire speaking to the National Assembly on July 11th, 1949. Until now, Martinique, Guadeloupe, and Réunion enjoyed in the electoral domain a system which was of their own. A certain portioning of the cantons operated, an equitable partition, I would even say a natural partition, so very rooted in the soil, and which as such had never raised any protest in the past. And what is it that we are proposing today? To do brutally in a blind vote to defeat that which has stood for a century of Antillean and Reunion history. These proceedings are an indignity to democracy. The government tells us that a division is necessary to assimilate the electoral mode applied in these departments to that of the metropole. But the principle of departmentalization had never been one of mechanical homogenization. I would even say that it was to the contrary. Why, therefore, hasten to suppress, under the pretext of assimilation, a mode of voting which is traditional in the overseas departments? So what's going on here? Martinique had long enjoyed pre-existing electoral districts that, for better or worse, were rooted in geography and history. And as the French were wont to do, the metropole used Martinique's departmentalization as an excuse to redraw those district boundaries. This is just gerrymandering, basically. It proposed to redraw those districts in a way that not only destroyed traditional boundaries of communities, it also made the proportionality between the number of constituents and representatives wildly uneven. So some areas had way too many representatives, others had way too few. The result, Césaire went on to point out, committed what he called an indignity to democracy. It, quote, snatched from our people what was left to them, our true representation. So what are Sengor and Césaire up to? The short answer is they wanted a mass franchise, but they wanted it organized in such a way that corporate racial voice could be heard, a collective racial voice, one that wasn't an aggregation of individuals, but contoured with people's history or culture. And they wanted universal suffrage to enhance rather than diminish what was believed to be the distinctive voice of African or Caribbean peoples. So they want to be heard as Africans, not as individuals. The idea that universal suffrage should be organized to somehow enunciate the voice of racial groups is difficult for us to accept today. But for these two poet politicians, unless there was some kind of institutional solution to protect the distinctive voice of racial groups, universal suffrage would have inadvertently become a vector for cultural assimilation. It would, again, to quote Césaire, rob them of their true representation. They didn't only want inclusion into the franchise, they wanted to give voice to a racial people. Were Césaire and Sengor recapitulating a kind of racial essentialism? Why should we think that anything like a corporate racial voice exists, never mind that it's something that universal suffrage could actually enunciate? It's actually hard to imagine any race or civilization speaking unless we accept the most crass forms of racial essentialism. I've argued elsewhere that I think things are actually a bit more complicated here, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But for our purposes today, what matters is this. Part of the reason Césaire and Sengor wanted to organize the franchise to enunciate a distinctively African voice was because they believed, like Du Bois, that African civilization contained the seed of a non-Soviet style communism, what they came to call African socialism. So recall that Du Bois himself drew a direct relationship between universal suffrage and industrial democracy. Here's Césaire saying much the same in Discourse on Colonialism. Every day that passes, every denial of justice brings home to us the value of our old societies. They were communal societies, never societies of the many for the few. They were societies that now are only anti-capitalist, as has been said, but also anti-capitalist. They were democratic societies always, they're cooperative societies, fraternal societies. If there's something they want to shield from assimilation, it's the anti-capitalist values of African communalism. Sengor harped on this point too, again and again. In 1962, Sengor distinguished his socialism from scientific socialism, so the socialism of the Soviet Union. African socialism, Sengor argued, rejected atheism and violence, and it embraced not collectivization, but communalism. And in 1961 speech called The Nation and the African Voice of Socialism, Sengor again defended a distinctive African socialism that, unlike the Soviet kind, would uplift the material prosperity of Africans, but emphasizing spiritual wealth and federalism. For Du Bois, Césaire, and Sengor, the franchise was a way for Africans to gift an alternative value system to the world. We don't have to necessarily even buy their arguments, though, to appreciate how much their proposals terrified white elites in the metropole. Consider Adolf Landry, affiliated with the MRP party, and who had this to say about Sengor's draft constitution in Le Monde in 1946. What is the scope of this Article 5? The French ressortissants, the natives, as we say more often, of the French overseas territories, are electors. For what elections? Certainly not those of the Act Française. That would just be crazy, right? They will be electors for elections for all assemblies of France by direct and universal suffrage. For Landry, extending the franchise to the former colonies would mean that quote unquote natives would have a say in metropolitan affairs, and nothing was crazier. Consider also the deputy Edouard Herriot, who took the podium on August 27th, 1946, to denounce the draft constitution. How many citizens will there be in the overseas territories? According to many, there will be more than those in the territories of the metropole. That citizens of the overseas territories will be more numerous than citizens of the metropole. France would thereby become the colony of her former colonies. Herriot saying the quiet part out loud. If you make universal suffrage apply to the whole empire, then colonial subjects would outnumber metropolitan ones. The colonizers would become the colonized. The tables would be turned, and nothing was more terrifying, nothing more offensive to reason. Sengor interrupted and shouted, "That's racism," but the effect was like dynamite. Now everyone saw how high the stakes were and how expensive the stakes were. One more example. When the Finance and Budget Committee was asked to comment on César's proposal that social benefits be extended on an equal basis to the overseas departments, here is their conclusion. In order to achieve this goal, equal standard of living, French citizens taken as a whole would have to agree to a 25 to 30% reduction in their standard of living for the benefit of our overseas compatriots. We must therefore take a strong stance against applying equal standards of living. And since political, social, and economic equality is neither achievable nor desired, then there's nothing further to discuss about assimilation. If former colonies became part of France, if they were extended citizenship and a franchise, then they would demand, and they did demand, that social welfare would apply to them too. And if that happened, the amount of wealth that have to be redistributed to the colonies would literally bankrupt France. It'd be one of the greatest acts of economic vengeance in modern history, and France wouldn't be much more than a pile of matchsticks. Neoliberal universal suffrage. For a lot of us here, it's probably no surprise that neoliberal intellectuals have a role in this story. Their role, though, isn't that of implacable opponents to universal suffrage. For sure, one person, one vote alarmed them. To them, the formula sounded like revolutionary numerology. Even so, when mid-century neoliberals confronted mass franchise, post-war planning, and decolonization, they didn't react simply as reactionaries. On the contrary, they styled themselves an avant-garde, reinterpreting universal suffrage in a modernist key and locating its utopian promise in the competitive marketplace. Here, in this second view of universal suffrage, the agora became the stock exchange, and every dollar spent was a ballot cast. Here in the free market, free agents expressed the amplitude of their voice through the strength or weakness of their purchasing power. Here, a device governed social order that was far better than the vox populi, the price mechanism. From their purchase in London, Chicago, Cape Town, Paris, Geneva, mid-20th century neoliberals fought to demolish the theory of popular sovereignty. At the moment, its wildest dream was becoming true in the colonies, universal suffrage. The neoliberal view of universal suffrage was nothing like the one imagined by anti-colonial radicals. To our collective loss, looks a lot closer to the version we got. Already by 1950, the intersection between universal suffrage and decolonization was as plain as day to Ludwig von Mises. The famed Austrian economist believed neoliberals needed a distinct response to the end of empire. It was at his prompting that the 1951 Mont Pelerin Society meeting at Beauvallon, France, took up the matter. At the meeting, Friedrich Hayek had helped create the Mont Pelerin Society after the war, which had been meeting annually since 1947 to renew liberalism and protect what they called Western humanism. The society functioned as a kind of early think tank for what would become neoliberalism. Its membership was international, concentrated among Europeans, yet soon to be dominated by Americans. At their fourth meeting in France, the American Henry Hazlitt took up the charge and criticized President Truman's Point program. And the Point 4 program was an initiative to disperse American foreign aid to quote unquote developing countries. John Jukes from Oxford denounced anti-colonial demands for economic collectivism, and other conference panels at the 1951 meeting addressed underdevelopment. Other conference panels at the 1951, panelists urged the group to reconsider colonial economics at other panels. By the late 1950s, it was impossible to escape the sight of a rotting imperial global order. A ring of fire was burning all along the tropics. Its heat was felt above all in the fury of Algerian and Vietnamese freedom fighters. Ubiquitous anti-colonialism made the question of colonial suffrage unavoidable. So consider Arthur Shenfield. A naturalized British citizen, economist, and lawyer, Shenfield joined the nascent neoliberal intellectual scene when he arrived at London School of Economics in 1939. He spent decades active in the Mont Pelerin Society, where he served as president from 1972 to 1974. At the 1957 meeting in St. Moritz, Switzerland, Shenfield audaciously declared that it was anti-colonialism which is the problem. I hardly need tell liberals that it is not easy for them to advocate the rule of others for their own good. Yet liberals must understand the dangers of one man, one vote. So hence for Shenfield, liberalism called for ambivalence towards democracy. They didn't have to be Democrats, even if they found democracy hard to reject. What Shenfield called a sophisticated liberalism, so neoliberalism, had to be attuned to the dangers of national and especially economic self-determination. In Shenfield's case, the ambivalence was temporary. In the coming years, South African apartheid hardened his anti-democratic anxieties into firm apologies for racial hierarchy. At a Rockford College address in 1969, Shenfield protested Gunnar Myrdal's popularity in America, and he denounced the suicidal self-flagellation of college students complaining about quote unquote Western civ. Colonialism wasn't the West's original sin, Shenfield complained, and his leftists love to say, and limiting the franchise wasn't only forgivable, but it was desirable for all races involved. Waving the banner of 19th century liberalism, Shenfield warned, quote, the current belief, supreme sanctity of the principle of one man, one vote arises from the deplorable modern failure to appreciate the hideous dangers of totalitarian democracy. So mass enfranchisement would lead to social disintegration. Shenfield even told his audience that Eldridge Cleaver's Soul on Ice, quote, is reminiscent of Mein Kampf. Three years later, in an open letter to Ian Smith, Rhodesia's prime minister, Shenfield doubled down in ways that still have the power to shock. The world denounces you because you reject the concept of one man, one vote. Throw the denunciation back in the denouncer's teeth and teach the world a lesson in true liberalism. The great liberals of the 18th and 19th centuries knew the difference between liberty and democracy. They knew that majority rule could be an engine for peaceful political change and therefore praiseworthy. But they also knew that it could be an engine of tyranny over minorities, which is exactly what has become in the countries of progressive taxation of the West. According to Shenfield, mitigating universal suffrage's danger in America was hard, but doable. But in Rhodesia, a Black majority country, it was impossible. Majority rule in Rhodesia would mean liberty's immediate extinction. Declare, therefore, that in Rhodesia, the answer to the cry of majority rule is no, no, never. It's easy to see why Shenfield isn't especially well remembered today. He's an average economist, and he wasn't a great political theorist. His was not the stuff of intellectual immortality. What's harder to dismiss is how pervasive his arguments were. William Hutt, a Cape Town-based British economist and Shenfield contemporary, was less enthusiastic about racial discrimination. Yet he too warns us about one person, one vote. Hutt was convinced that racial discrimination would naturally expire under conditions of unfair market competition because the market was colorblind. So long, at least, as the state protected the market from the emergence of any legal privileges for groups. According to Hutt, but that was exactly what one person, one vote would lead to. In his 1964 book, The Economics of the Color Bar, Hutt argued that the trouble with universal suffrage was that it would empower non-white majorities to use the legal system to secure privileges in the labor market. One person, one vote invited tyranny of the majority, perhaps even vengeance against white settlers. Universal suffrage would merely mean the transfer of power to a new political majority, a Black majority, with no constitutional limitations to prevent retaliatory abuse. If there's to be a bloodless solution to South Africa's race problems, it will, I suggest, demand the acceptance of the philosophy of free enterprise, better described in the 19th century sense. A mountain of evidence starts coming into view the more we look. John Davenport, a little-known journalist, the future superstar Milton Friedman, the ubiquitous Friedrich Hayek. Each of them found in Empire's twilight a reason to oppose an egalitarian franchise. And if territories with non-European majorities provided them the clearest opportunities to oppose universal suffrage, it's worth underscoring how diffident they were towards universal suffrage in general. So Frank Knight and his student James Buchanan, who's the father of public choice theory, argued for years that majority rule had to be circumscribed the better to protect certain social structures from modification by majorities. Henry Simons, remembered as a more reasonable member of the U Chicago School of Economics, conceded in his 1948 book, Economic Policy for a Free Society, the pamphlet, that democracy didn't actually require strict universal adult suffrage. Quote, qualitative selection for suffrage should not be hastily ruled out. It's important that we not misunderstand what's going on here. Their skepticism of majority rule is clear enough, but what doesn't follow from this history is that they actually preferred minority rule. And this, more than anything, I think puts the neo in neoliberalism. They actually also hated minority rule. And this is part of their break with their predecessors, like Joseph Schumpeter, for whom minority rule was actually both inevitable and sort of preferable to participatory democracy. The neoliberals in the Mont Pelerin Society associated minority rule with the rule of private interest groups, especially labor unions, which were ever keen to rent seek or win special privileges from the state. So neoliberals in the 1950s and the 1960s actually despised minority rule as much as they hated majority rule because they were especially worried about minority rule in the form of political elites, labor unions, and at least at first, monopolies. What they actually wanted was unanimity, not majority rule, not minority rule, but rule as the unanimous expression of everyone's preferences and the spontaneous coordination of the market. This type of rule can sound kind of abstract and weird. Isn't unanimous rule just like the totalitarian democracy they're so afraid of? It helps to contrast it with every political theorist's favorite political theorist, but I'm projecting Rousseau, who of course remains, I think, but my opinion carries weight here, who is the greatest theorist of modern democracy, because he understands that democracy is a politics of self-transformation. Democracy, for Rousseau, requires our reincarnation from individual natural creatures into collective moral agents. Democracy requires that we reckon with our interdependence, to lean on others as they lean on us, and to crown that bond of collective self-determination with the name of freedom. Democracy, for Rousseau, involves acquiring a voice we never knew we had, because, and this is the miracle, we only discover our voice when others discover theirs too. It's unnerving, Rousseau knows, to have something as intimate as your voice depend on your bond with others. That's how it is with the voice of the people. Nobody, least of all Rousseau, thought freedom was easy. Neoliberals also dreamed of universal participation, but unlike Rousseau, there is no resplendent voice of the people. No vox populi. There's just a commodities price point. For Shenfield, Hayek, and Hutt, democracy isn't the product of our rebirth into collective self-determination. Democracy is a system for the coordination of adaptive individual preferences. Hutt actually endorsed vote buying for this reason. If I don't like my electoral options, Hutt argued, why shouldn't I sell my ballot? Why shouldn't my ballot be exchangeable for cash? Unlike in majority voting, nobody loses under a vote buying scheme because nobody gets left out. There's no voiceless minority because everyone gets something with their ballot. An elected official or cash to buy a coffee, your ballot, your choice. Many neoliberals sought a vision of democratic rule that was inclusive and inegalitarian. It was inclusive because it was inegalitarian. In market coordination, they believed they discovered a method of collective rule better than one person, one vote. Frank Fetter's 1905, The Principle of Economics, had already made the analogy. In that textbook, Frank Fetter suggested that enfranchisement in the market only cost a penny. And I missed a quotation, so this slide is for the next quote. But in his 1948 Planning and the Price Mechanism, the London School of Economics economist James Mead called the price mechanism an efficient and secure election machinery, surpassing by far the traditional ballot. And for his part, William Hutt claimed that buyers in a marketplace were actually better informed about their preferences than voters of an electorate. As always, though, von Mises is the most intransigent and dogmatic of them all. No topic electrified him as much as the analogy between universal suffrage and the marketplace. In The Political Democracy, he wrote, in Human Action, only the votes cast for the majority candidate or the majority plan are effective in shaping the course of affairs. The votes polled by the minority do not directly influence policies. But not so in the market. In the market, which he called a kind of consumer's assembly, quote, no vote is cast in vain. Every penny exerts pressure on commodity prices in the unending feedback loops between supply and demand. Every voice, every penny, however pitiful, counts. In the marketplace, consumers reign sovereign. And business owners are, quote, mandatories or trustees of the consumers, revocable by an election daily repeated. This is a stylized image of the market, to say the least, and it's easy to write it off as simplistic because it was. But we can't fully feel the power of mid-century neoliberalism unless we underscore the utopian modernism of its political vision, its promise that no vote has to be cast in vain. Every penny was a ballot. So let me just conclude by highlighting what I think are the biggest differences between these competing conceptual portraits. So there are some obvious differences here. For one, they differ in who they benefit. Du Bois was explicit about what he wanted. In virtually everything he wrote after the Second World War, Du Bois urged readers to, quote, believe in socialism for Africa. The point of anti-colonial universal suffrage was to transform the franchise into a medium by which African voices could be heard as Africans. And what Boyce demanded was, well, African socialism, an infusion of communal values into a competitive capitalist society, and the enormous redistribution of wealth back to the slaves who made it. But in the case of the neoliberal theorists of universal suffrage, who they wanted to benefit actually depended. So William Hutt thought everyone would benefit because he believed that marketplaces were colorblind. Arthur Shenfield was much more explicit. He thought it should be white minorities that benefit. In both cases, of course, in practice, white minority rule was the outcome because they were endorsing systems of suffrage where ballots could be weighed like one weighs a bank account. But there's a less obvious difference between these two that's just as important. It's not actually only a question of here of who's included and who's excluded, who benefits and who doesn't. There's a philosophical difference at stake. Anti-colonial critics believed in the concept of the voice of the people. They actually believed there was such a thing as collective voice, which was irreducible to the individuals that made it up. Hence, Sengor's hope for a suffrage that wasn't individualistic but familial. On the other side, neoliberal economists had no interest in the concept of the voice of the people, but they actually didn't really believe in the concept of individual voices either. What they believed in wasn't the voice of the people, but the impersonal voice of the system as expressed through the price mechanism. And this difference is key. Anti-colonial critics believed in the idea of sovereignty. They believed in the idea that there are agents who are the authors of their own actions and that there are subjects who can have voices. Indeed, they believed that agency existed. But at the most extreme, neoliberal critics didn't even believe in the idea of either individual or collective voice because they didn't believe in the theory of sovereignty in the first place. A price reflects a commodity's valuation, determined by the mutual adjustment processes of supply and demand. A price is composed of people's subjective preferences, but the price itself is nobody's actual subjective preference. It's the system's objective adaptation to those subjective preferences. Put simply, in a market-to-place democracy, there's a collective voice without a collective subject. There's a democracy, but no sovereign people. And for me, this is the big philosophical takeaway. What puts the neo in neoliberalism isn't that they were anti-democratic, but that their vision of democracy had no room for the concept of collective self-determination. We, the people, don't speak, the market speaks us. And that's the end. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Kevin. So I think we've got a couple of questions just to start us off. Reeve, do you want to start us off here with the first question?
Sure, I would, but I want to start by saying that that was a fantastic paper, and really sort of your approach gives me a take on political philosophy I haven't seen before, which is sort of disrupts a lot of the, what I usually hear when I hear people doing history of political thought or just political theory. I got a million questions. Oh, and also I think your approach too gives a really important kind of philosophical ballast to what is in Naomi Klein's hands is a really crude point about the anti-democratic tendencies of neoliberal reform after 1973. What you seem to be making clear is that there actually was a sort of a philosophical framework for that, indifference towards actual political democracy, or universal suffrage, whatever you want to put it. I have a lot of questions, but I guess the main one I want to, the easier one to ask is do you have a sense of the relationship of César, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the name of your second anti-colonial thinker and politician. Do you have a sense of they have a clear idea of who African people are and who the people of, was it Guadeloupe?
Were Martinique and Guadeloupe and Reunion.
Okay. Yeah. So I have sort of a two-sided question. One is, what's the relationship of their picture of those people? I mean, how accurate a bead on the tendencies, the political sort of possibilities of their people did they have? But the other one is, was their vision, of people voting in families, or what relationship did their thinking and their view of like sort of universal suffrage and self-rule, what was their relationship to the specifically political aspirations of their constituents? Do you have a sense of that at all?
Is the norm for your workshop for folks to respond to each question one by one?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ree, for the question. Okay, so your first question is the $1 million question, and it is unbelievably difficult to answer, because here's the trick. They constantly speak of the voice of peoples, or actually sometimes the voice of Africanity, but they're also surrealists. And if you read their writings in more detail, they want it both ways. Sengor specifically calls Africa a myth. They are perfectly aware that there's no actual pre-existing homogeneity to the thing called the African peoples. The way that the metaphor that Sengor prefers are musical metaphors. He describes his proposed system as an orchestra, where every instrument would have its distinctive voice, and yet they could play together. And so he often described the voice of Africa not actually as a univocal voice, but as a harmonic or orchestral kind of voice. Whether you can institutionalize this or not is $1 million question. Sengor proposed many federalist solutions to try to achieve this, but his understanding of African voice, he's drawing on musical metaphors to try to get at the idea of a voice that can be internally differentiated, yet still be coherently spoken of as a voice. Now, how well does this match with their constituents' views? These are like some pretty elite intellectuals. So I don't know about in Sengor's case. Césaire is actually extraordinarily popular with his constituency. They call him Papa Césaire. And in Fort-de-France, when people want to see him on the street, they just call him Papa. So in Césaire's case, there's good reason to think that he has his pulse very clearly on what his constituents prefer. In fact, when many left-wing critics accused Césaire of capitulating to assimilationism, Césaire's immediate response was, "I don't know what to tell you. My constituents overwhelmingly want to remain part of France." So they may be elite intellectuals, but they're in pretty close dialogue with their constituencies. Yeah.
Thank you.
So Cindy Ewing has a question that also relates to Reeves. So I'm going to go ahead and call on Cindy for the next question. Go ahead, Cindy.
Thanks so much, Jenny. And thank you, Kevin, for such an amazing talk. I'm really interested in these questions. And I actually wanted to ask you about the anti-colonial universal suffrage side of your paper, and maybe talk about some potential limits. So often anti-colonial methods gesture at the universal, but then they're constrained by politics. So I'm interested in your views on the globality of Sengor's political philosophy. So you mentioned Sengor promoted African socialism. You emphasize spiritual wealth as distinct from Soviet or scientific Marxism. So to me, that's a difference on the nature of their anti-capitalism. And I also understand that African socialism also tended to emphasize communalism specific to Africa. So this was used by Sengor to distinguish that idea from Soviet universalism. And they even criticized the Negritude movement, criticized Soviet communism on its universalist aspirations. So I wonder if there's a potential inner contradiction. How does Sengor's universal suffrage fit within African socialism? So does it show that in fact Sengor was a universalist, though he claimed not to be in distinguishing from Soviet-style communism? Or was the promotion of anti-colonial suffrage not global at all? Maybe we would argue it was just limited to the Afro territories of the French Empire alone. So I kind of wonder how contingent is universal suffrage? Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Cindy, for those questions. They're both committed universalists. In fact, that's what makes Césaire and Sengor not fit well with the anti-universalist strand of subsequent post-colonial theory. So they hate Soviet universalism, but because they actually, so when they turn to African communalism, they think that African traditions have a universalism that is actually in practice more universal than the Soviet variety. So in their philosophical view, they basically have the better universalism, but they're still playing that game. And in fact, Sengor says, like every essay, on a civilization of the universal, a civilization of the universal. What he actually has in mind is very similar to what Du Bois talks about, that every culture kind of has its distinctive contribution to a culture that should belong to the globe as a whole. But as you point out, this is a super African specific understanding of universalism that may be better than the Soviet version, but still Afrocentric and still Francophony, basically. I don't know what else to say, except that it ran into real political limits. By the 60s and the 70s, Sengor is constantly decrying what he called the balkanization of Africa. He's like, they tried to generate continental unity. They tried to create a kind of Pan-African unity, and all they got was intra-African competition. So it was a dream that was betrayed by the political realities of actually having to navigate, the difficulties of being independent. So I don't know what else to say there, except that their universalism ran into limits too.
Doesn't it help explain why African socialism falls apart? Because it can't actually materialize any of its universalist claims. So even though it calls for universal suffrage, in practice, when you see African countries actually try to constitute some type of voting system or enact African socialist policies, Nkrumah ends up criticizing Sengor for being kind of universalist when he claimed not to be. So I just wonder if there's a contradiction in all of it or not.
My instinct is to say yes, because I can't imagine a universalism that wouldn't be self-contradictory in the end. Mm-hmm. That said, I actually think Sengor gets a bit too much crap for this. So Sengor's legacy post-independent Senegal, I know is really dicey, and this is not the time and place to re-adjudicate Sengor's legacy. But his theories of federalism is basically infinitely layered sovereignty. So like nests within nests within nests within nests. And the idea is that you would achieve the universal scale of his humanism precisely by creating basically what was the most elaborate form of global federalism you could imagine. So he was like, you'd have federalism within Africa, and then Africa would federate with Europe, and then Europe and Africa would federate with the rest of the world, with Asia. Totally utopian. Yes, it was probably self-contradictory, but I think maybe my instinct is that I think people are a bit too hard on what Sengor, a little bit too hard on them. Yeah, their experiment failed, but I don't know, anti-colonial revolution is really hard.
Fair enough.
I don't know if, yeah, anyways.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, William Kemp has the next question.
Hi, I really appreciated the talk. And I think it was really fantastic. I had a couple of questions. One was sort of definitional. And when I read about universal suffrage, often that's, if you're looking in the 19th century in Britain, a number of countries, that might just be male suffrage. And I was wondering, really, how broad is this conception of universal suffrage? Because usually when you think of universal suffrage, there's still caveats and exceptions in most countries that it has. So I was wondering, is this really a movement for much more broad universal suffrage, or is this just broader universal suffrage? And then the second one that I had was a little more specific, which was, it was wondering about the movements for universal suffrage in the colonies. And I was wondering, were these really sort of grassroots movements that were really from the ground up starting in the colonies, or is there a lot of that sort of French political influence that you were sort of discussing in the talk? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, William, for that question. How broad was this suffrage? That's a really hard question to answer because it's super context dependent. So the children problem, so they actually, every person on the anti-colonial side endorses both male and women's suffrage. So this is why I actually explicitly point out, if you take that seriously, then in fact, most of these colonies achieved true universal suffrage well before some of the developed countries who continue to exclude various groups, including, like, France doesn't give women the right to vote until 1944. So it's pretty extensive. The children problem is always a problem. I think Sengor partly turns to familial ballots to circumvent it. He knows he's in dicey territory. In fact, Sengor gives speech after speech after speech defending, making sure that everyone not forget that women's suffrage is included in universal suffrage. But the family ballot is supposed to find an alternative way of having the ballots counted that would kind of include children's interest without giving them like a literal ballot? That's a good question. I don't have a good answer to it. I guess the best answer I can say is that they were experimenting with the scope. How grassroots is it? Pretty grassroots. If you actually go through, for example, the transcripts of the various Pan-African Congresses, universal suffrage is a demand in virtually every country's list of demands of the Pan-African Congresses. In West Africa and French Africa, the African Unity Movement, I can't remember, they have a complicated acronym, I can't remember what they're called, released several manifestos which make universal suffrage a key part, actually, of a program of creating African unity, weirdly enough. You wouldn't think a document promoting African unity would care about suffrage, but it's in there. So there's some evidence that there is, in fact, grassroots support for this.
All right. The next question is from Courtney Bullard.
Hi. Your talk on simulation was really like new to me. Like I guess I just never really thought about it. You think about how like people are disenfranchised or like certain votes, like people don't have a voice in a certain way. So thinking it from like in a simulation point of view, I feel like that opens it up like wider to like the impact that means on people, like how people vote. So just to expand, if you could expand on that more in terms of like the neoliberal perspective to a simulation, was the goal, was there any concern from that? Because like your examples are predominantly, you know, like Black voices on the anti-colonial and white voices on the neoliberal. So were there people in the neoliberal perspective for universal suffrage? Do they care about a simulation? Was the goal to have it, to not have it? The market answers that question itself. Because part of it is I'm at a disadvantage because I don't know if I'll ever truly understand economics. That's completely lost on me in a lot of ways. So in terms of like, I guess you could say like, because if the individual doesn't matter and groups of people, if the people don't matter, the system matters, what would they have said about these cultural concerns?
Yeah, this goes down a serious rabbit hole. If I had infinite time, we would need to talk about the fact that that the neoliberal systems theory is actually rooted in cybernetics. Cybernetics is the emergent system science that they're all citing. In fact, the neoliberal economists are attending cybernetics conferences. Of course, it's not called cybernetics, but servo-mechanical study at the time. But if you look at scientists, I see Reeves' mouth wide open. So the assimilation question, they don't even have a problem with assimilation because they are already on board with early cybernetic self-spontaneous systems theory that imagines society as adaptive variables. Like there's nothing to assimilate to for them. Their whole conception of society is as a cybernetic system that adapts and learns over time, which is why there aren't individuals. That's humanist stuff from the 19th century. There are servo-mechanical routes like synapses that communicate information via price signals from different parts of society to other parts of society. So the way we talk about assimilation, they are just operating with it. This is why I emphasize their modernism. It's wrong to construe neoliberalism as reactionary. I think that just emphasized my last word. They're like, you know, horrible period, the sentence.
Great. Colin Keelty has the next question.
I'm coming online. Hi, Kevin. This was awesome. I had a question. I'm a little bit worried that I'm retreading some of the ground that Cindy already covered. But one thing I'm curious about is the relationship between Francophone and Anglophone decolonial thinkers. So there's this kind of, well, I don't know if it's an apocryphal line or not. There's a history of the 1958 All-African Peoples Conference where there's this line that's essentially quoted from George Padmore that he defines the African as somebody who believes in one person, one vote. And so it's a really close knitting of the notion of Pan-Africanism and identity and the notion of universal suffrage. But one of the interesting things, and I think it's tied to Cindy's point because it's Padmore and Nkrumah making this point, they're trying to kind of transcend negritude with this idea. And so I'm just not sure how to understand the relationship between these two kind of linguistic communities and making what might seem to be similar arguments, but also seeming to have a tension or a conflict.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. And it gets back to Cindy's point too. So, I mean, it's Padmore's transcripts from African Congresses where you see one man, one vote appear virtually every list of demands. So I think that's actually absolutely right. And there may be even the broad, if you're even allowed to generalize at this level, the problem of culturalism does seem specific to the Francophone thinkers because of the Republican model of cultural assimilation, which British intellectual traditions are a little bit more forgiving to that kind of pluralism. So I would assume that's actually why the obsession with preserving a cultural voice and resisting assimilation through the suffrage would be a heightened concern for Francophone thinkers. Plus the different histories of colonial in which the French go for cultural assimilation, whereas many British colonies are basically administrative subordination. And that means that the culture problem is much more pronounced in Francophone spaces. All that to say, I think you and Cindy are probably just right. I'm not entirely sure what to do with it, except to say yes, probably. But I don't know what to do with it. Yeah.
And just one follow-up: did any of the Francophone authors use a French phrase equivalent to one man, one vote, or is this too individualizing really for their imagination?
Yeah, un homme, une voix. So a person to vote, but it does come later.
Okay.
I mean, maybe the better way to just say this is before, in the very early years after World War II, when it's just not clear what decolonization is supposed to look like, they were more willing to experiment with these alternative suffrage culture solutions. Basically, by the 60s, Césaire and Sengor, I mean, at this point, it becomes clear that independence is the route to go. Césaire in particular becomes totally cynical about any attempt on making Martinique equally assimilated to France. I don't know this for sure, but my instinct is if you were to look to their writings, they fall back much more on one man, one vote in a more systematic way. I think it's telling that these culturalist arguments are basically when Sengor and Césaire are closest to negritude. Obviously, both of them move away from negritude as the decades go on, and presumably as they move further away, they also get less attached to the agenda of protecting a distinctive Africanity within a suffrage system. But I'm just guessing at this point.
All right, I think we've gone through everyone in the initial queue. So Reeve, I think, had another question that he wanted to ask.
I never thought I'd get to ask another question. Yeah, you may have just left this out for a question of time, but in case you haven't, it seems to me that a big part of the difference between your two visions of actually, I'm a little skeptical of universal suffrage, but sort of participation in outcomes is that a big difference is what gets cordoned off from collective influence. In other words, the very idea of economic democracy suggests that some things are up for grabs in a situation of universal suffrage, including property relationships, the rules governing contracts, things like that. Whereas it's the more you say, and this goes with my own reading of Hayek and Friedman, is that that actually their vision of what is political is extremely narrow. There are certain, and they probably would have conceded that well, maybe they wouldn't have conceded, I don't know, but that there are a whole lot of issues that just can't be addressed under their system, and they seem to be fine with that and actually open about it. They don't see it as a problem. So that questions of property relationships, you know, well, all that stuff I listed and many other things as well, just never get addressed by the market.
Yeah, thanks. So I think you could look at it two ways. One is that they have they cordon off much more from democratic control via something like suffrage. I think that's right. And so in that view, the negative critics here would be massively expanding the domains of human life that are subject to collective decision-making. The problem with that is that, in fact, most of them endorse vote buying, which actually then suggests the flip side, that they are forget limiting the domain of politics. They would like politics to become a domain of economics. That do you want your candidate to win? If it looks like your candidate stands no chance of winning, why not sell your ballot for $50 since it's going to be useless anyway, and go buy yourself something with the $50 for your ballot? So is that limiting the understanding of politics, or is that reversing the relationship between politics and economics between the negritude folks and the neoliberals on the other? I suspect that's another way of looking at it too.
I think that's a really good point, but I don't think they're mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
In other words, yes, I think that the bigger picture is the one that you just pointed out. But at the same time, more things are just left up to the system or not left up to conscious choice. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Some things are left, more things are left out of the realm of conscious and especially collective choice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, it's why I framed it in the way that you flagged at the very beginning, is that the better way to look at what the neoliberals are doing is offering a non-sovereign theory of democracy.
Okay.
A self-regulating system that doesn't require a collective decision-making procedure to be the source of law. Again, the cybernetic system. In fact, some political theorists are starting to call their model a kind of cybernetic democracy, which is a series of servo mechanisms and mutual communication with one another. And therefore, you don't presuppose either the concept of the people or collective voice for the theory to work.
All right, great. The next question is from Ani Chen.
Hi, Kevin. This was such an awesome paper. Thank you so much for giving it. My question was about African communalism. And I know earlier you sort of talked about this problem of racial essentialism. But my question has to do more so with the institutional design of this communalism within Africa and the Caribbean colonies themselves. And I'm just wondering sort of what César and Sengor as Francophone thinkers imagined would happen in non-Francophone contexts in the Caribbean and in Africa. And I was wondering if you could elaborate more on that point.
That is a great question. On the second one, I have no idea. There is, in fact, I wish someone, okay, actually I'm sure someone's already done this, written a comparative study of British versus French Caribbean anti-colonialism. Like if it's already out there, I hope someone can recommend it to me, like a really tight comparative, because that's a great question. As far as I can tell, they're basically not talking to each other in the 40s. I could be wrong about that, but that's my impression. So I don't even think it's on their radar about how you transport some of these Francophone conceptions of African communalism into non-Francophone Caribbean spaces. Because it's not even clear to me that they have similar metaphysics of what a family is. This isn't something that we much talk about. Sengor writes essays and essays and essays talking about how the family that he has in mind is not the nuclear family. It's much closer to actually what, you know, that at the time in Indian political thought you consider village democracy. That's really what Sengor has in mind with the meaning of the family. I have no idea if that is shared by British anti-colonial intellectuals at the time in the Caribbean. Obviously, I think what you asked was 100% correct, and I just don't know enough, frankly. I wish, if you want to figure it out though, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, my dissertation is kind of taking over my life, but if I do find out, I'll let you know. But thank you.
All right, I think we've gone through the queue. Thank you so much, Kevin, for this wonderful talk. If everyone wants to join me in thanking him for this awesome colloquium, thank you all for being here. And next week, we'll have Jacob Levy from McGill University giving his talk, Rethinking the Separation of Powers. Have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you soon.